In the summer of 1946, the United States anchored around 95 warships in a Pacific lagoon and set off 2 atomic bombs right in among them. These weren't empty target hulls, they were loaded. Real fuel, live shells, torpedoes, whole squadrons of aircraft, some stocked to nearly full wartime capacity. A carrier, a Japanese battleship, an old American dreadnought, all of it went to the bottom fully armed. And in 80 years, nobody has ever gone down to take any of it back. I want to be clear about how strange that is. When you first hear it, your brain reaches for the easy answer. They forgot. Nobody bothered. It's the middle of nowhere, 1,000 miles from anything, so out of sight, out of mind. That's not what happened. Those ships sank loaded on purpose, and the reason they're still loaded is a choice somebody made and keeps making, right up to today. To understand it, you have to go back to what that lagoon actually was in the summer of 1946. It wasn't a junkyard. It was the single most watched science experiment on the face of the planet. The operation was called Crossroads, and the question behind it was blunt. The war had just ended. Everyone had seen what one bomb did to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and now the admirals wanted to know something specific. What does an atomic bomb do to a fleet? Not a city, a navy, out on the water, ships of steel with armor belts and watertight compartments. Could a battleship take it and keep fighting? So the United States hauled a collection of old, surplus, and captured warships out to Bikini Atoll and anchored them in the lagoon as targets. Around 95 of them clustered around a bullseye. 4 American battleships, 2 aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, even surrendered German and Japanese ships that had been enemy vessels barely a year earlier. The whole thing was run by Vice Admiral William Blandy, under a command they called Joint Task Force 1, and at the time it was the largest peacetime military operation the United States had ever mounted. And underneath all that machinery sat one uncomfortable fact. Nobody running it actually knew what those bombs would do to those ships. That was the whole point of asking. This was the first nuclear test series anyone had staged since the war ended, and the first one ever run out on the open ocean instead of a desert. 2 bombs were set aside for the fleet, each about 23 kilotons, right in the range of the ones that had already leveled Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Around 160 aircraft were on hand just to film it and measure it. Here is what most people never think about. If you want to know what a bomb does to a real fighting fleet, you cannot test it on empty shells. An empty ship is not a warship. So the Navy loaded them to look like the real thing, with real fuel oil in the bunkers, live ammunition packed into the magazines, and aircraft sitting on the carrier decks. For the second test, some of these ships were stocked to nearly 95% of full wartime capacity. They were, for all practical purposes, ready to go to war. Nobody was going to sail them anywhere. They were sitting there waiting to be blown up. And it gets stranger because they didn't just load the ships with equipment, they loaded them with life. Thousands of test animals, pigs, goats, rats, were placed at battle stations across around 22 of the target ships, standing in for the sailors who'd normally be there. Within 3 months, 35% of them were dead, killed by the blast, by the radiation, or put down by the men studying what it had done to them. The idea was to measure what the blast and the radiation would do to a living body in a gun turret or an engine room. And what gets me is the picture itself. A whole armored fleet, fully fueled and armed, floating in a lagoon with not one human being aboard, waiting for the sky to open. And one of them got famous for refusing to die. There was a pig, later known to the whole country as Pig 311, penned below decks on a Japanese light cruiser called the Sakawa. The Sakawa went to the bottom. The pig, somehow, did not. So the story goes, she was found alive in the lagoon hours later, though I should say the Navy's own records are thin and some historians doubt the details. What nobody disputes is that she survived the test. She ended up at the National Zoo in Washington, lived 4 more years, and nobody could really explain how she'd made it, which, looking back, is kind of the whole point. Nobody understood any of this yet, and all of it, the loaded ships, the animals at battle stations, the bombs waiting, was staged to be seen. More than 40,000 men took part. The full task force ran past 200 ships. 131 reporters came to watch, from the United States, Britain, France, even the Soviet Union, along with official observers from 10 nations, plus the Secretary of the Navy and members of Congress who came out to watch it in person. The Navy itself called it the most observed, most photographed, most talked about scientific test ever conducted. Whatever was about to happen to those loaded ships, the entire world was going to be watching. The first bomb went off on July 1st. It was called Test Able, dropped from a B-29 and set to burst in the air about 500 feet above the fleet. And honestly, it was a letdown. The plane missed. The aim point was an old battleship painted bright orange so the bombardier couldn't lose it, and the bomb still landed well off the mark. When the smoke cleared, only about 5 ships had sunk. The rest were battered but still floating. To a lot of the reporters and even some of the officers watching, the takeaway was almost reassuring. Maybe a fleet could survive an atom bomb after all. Maybe the warship wasn't finished as a weapon. And I think that was the most dangerous idea anyone could have walked away with that day, because it was about to be proven dead wrong in front of the whole world. That reaction didn't age well, because the second test was a completely different animal, and the men running Crossroads knew it. Able had gone off in the air, Baker was going underneath. By the way, if you like stories where the real answer is hiding under the official one, that's basically this whole channel, so consider subscribing. Because what Baker did next is the reason this video exists. 3 weeks later, on July 25th, they hung the second bomb about 90 feet below the surface of the lagoon, slung under a landing craft right in the middle of the target fleet, and set it off down there. What happened next is one of the most filmed moments in history, and it still looks unreal. The explosion punched a column of water 6,000 feet into the sky, more than 2 million cubic yards of the lagoon thrown straight up, with ships tumbling around inside it like bath toys. A battleship weighing tens of thousands of tons got lifted clean off its keel. But the column wasn't the thing that doomed the fleet. When all that water came crashing back down, it rolled outward across the lagoon as a churning wall of radioactive mist and spray, hundreds of feet high, and it swept over every ship still floating. That base surge, as they called it, was a rolling cloud of contaminated spray close to 300 yards across, and it coated the entire fleet in a fine, wet, contaminated film. It was the first time in history a set of targets got soaked in immediate, concentrated fallout. The chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission would later call Baker the world's first nuclear disaster. And that word, contaminated, is the quiet hinge this whole story turns on. Hold on to it. Some ships went down in minutes, others took hours or days, and every one of them went to the bottom exactly as it had been loaded. Start with the big one, the USS Saratoga. She was an aircraft carrier, 888 feet of ship, and she'd come through Able with damage. Baker was too much. The blast flung the aircraft right off her flight deck into the lagoon, tore her open, and about 7 hours later, she settled onto the bottom, sitting almost perfectly upright. She's still there, and she's the reason divers come to Bikini Atoll, because she's one of only a handful of aircraft carriers in the world you can actually swim through. Her island rises to around 40 feet down. Her hangar deck sits deeper, and inside her and around her, the war is frozen in place. Helldiver dive bombers still sit in the hangar and scattered across the sand where Baker threw them. 350-pound and 500-pound bombs, aerial torpedoes, depth charges on the stern racks, all still aboard. There's one aircraft down there with bombs sitting in its open bomb bay. A nuclear weapon went off a few hundred yards away, and those bombs never did. They're still live right now, waiting. To me, that's the single strangest thing in that whole lagoon. Then there's the USS Arkansas, an old battleship that had served in both world wars. She didn't get 7 hours. When Baker's water column came up, the Arkansas was right beside it, and she was gone in a matter of minutes. She lies almost completely upside down at about 170 feet. And here's the one I keep coming back to. Her armor belt was over 11 inches of solid steel, the thickest protection a battleship had, and the pressure wave from that underwater blast bent it inward. It dished solid battleship armor concave, with hollows pressed into the hull as much as 6 feet deep. If you ever want to feel the force that went off beside a fully loaded fleet, you don't need a number. Just look at what it did to 11 inches of steel. If you're finding this as strange and haunting as I do, this is the exact kind of story I make this channel for. So stick with me, because the eeriest ship in that lagoon is the one I haven't told you about yet. Because the last one carries the darkest history of them all. The Japanese battleship Nagato. Back in December of 1941, Nagato was the flagship of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. and the order to attack Pearl Harbor was given from her deck. The signal confirming the strike had begun. Tora, Tora, Tora passed through that ship. By the end of the war, she was the last Japanese battleship still afloat, so the Americans took her out to Bikini to be a target, and Nagato was stubborn. She shrugged off Able. After Baker, she was still floating, barely marked, looking for all the world like she'd beaten the bomb. Then, 4 or 5 days later, in the dark, with nobody aboard, she quietly rolled over and went down. Today she lies completely upside down, her 16-inch guns hanging beneath the upturned hull, with the bridge where Pearl Harbor was set in motion, snapped off and lying in the sand beside her. Her enormous fuel bunkers are still down there with her, and they're part of what keeps the people who monitor that lagoon up at night. The ship that helped start the war in the Pacific is down there in the dark, hanging over her own guns. Of all of them, the Nagato is the one I can't stop thinking about. I don't really believe the ocean keeps score, but that ship, upside down in the dark, with the same guns she carried to Pearl Harbor hanging under her, it's hard not to feel like something got evened out down there. So that's how they got to the bottom, loaded. But it still doesn't answer the real question. Ships get salvaged all the time. Harbors get cleared, wrecks get stripped for scrap. Why, in 80 years, has nobody gone down and pulled the bombs and the fuel and the planes back out? This is where a lot of people think they know the answer, and they're wrong. It isn't the distance, and it isn't that anyone forgot. Go back to that word, contaminated. When crews motored out to the surviving ships after Baker to reclaim them, they found something nobody was ready for. The ships were radioactive. Not a little. Geiger counters spiked the moment men stepped aboard. Sailors were sent up with lye and foam and even coffee grounds to scrub the decks with no real method because no method existed. These were mostly young men with no protective gear worth the name, scrubbing warships that were quietly dosing them the whole time. And the detail that tells you how bad it really was comes from one man who stood on those decks. He was a young doctor on the radiological safety team named David Bradley, who later wrote a book about what he saw and called it No Place to Hide, because his whole point was that on those ships, there was nowhere the contamination wasn't. Nobody had ever tried to clean a ship soaked in fallout. It didn't work. They'd get pulled off after a few minutes because the readings were too high. A planned third test, a deep water shot called Charlie that was meant for the following year, was cancelled outright for one blunt reason. The Navy had realized it could not decontaminate its own ships. The ones that could still move were towed away and scuttled somewhere else. The ones that sank at Bikini were never worked, never stripped, never made safe. They were simply too hot to touch. But radioactivity is only half the answer, and the other half is the part I didn't see coming. Because as the years passed and the radiation eased, someone could have gone in, and a decision got made deliberately to leave everything exactly where it was. The National Park Service surveyed that fleet and described it as essentially the only unmodified museum of the birth of the atomic age. Every other relic of that moment got cleaned up, rebuilt, or thrown away. This lagoon still holds it whole. So instead of clearing the wrecks, the United States chose to protect them. The sunken fleet was recognized as a historic site. It became a war grave. And in 2010, Bikini Atoll was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The first in the Marshall Islands, precisely because those loaded, blast-scarred ships are the physical record of the day nuclear war stopped being a theory. And I'll be honest, I think that was the right call. Because once you scrub a wreck clean, there's nothing left for it to say. But a carrier that's still full of bombs, frozen at the exact second it happened, that says it all. So the live bombs stay in the hangar. The torpedoes stay in their tubes. Diving there only opened up in 1996. And even now, just a handful of people a year are allowed in, each one escorted by a local Bikinian and a councilman, under one rule that never bends. Look, don't take. Nobody is out there diffusing 500-pound bombs on a radioactive carrier 1,000 miles from the nearest city, and nobody's allowed to haul them up as trophies either. The ordnance isn't down there because it slipped everyone's mind. It's down there because it's guarded. The one thing that does worry the people watching the site isn't the bombs. It's the oil slowly leaking out of the corroding hulls, which is why surveys keep going back to check on a fleet that supposedly nobody touches. And none of this came free, though the people who paid for it were never the ones making the choices. Because before a single target was anchored in that lagoon, 167 people already lived on Bikini. In early 1946, a Navy Commodore named Ben Wyatt stood on the beach and asked them to leave so the test could go ahead, telling them it would be temporary and for the good of all mankind. Their leader, a man named Judah, agreed and said they would go believing everything was in the hands of God. On the 7th of March, they were loaded onto a ship and moved to another atoll called Rongerik. It couldn't feed them. The fish there made them sick and the trees barely produced, and within a couple of years they were close to starving. So they were moved again, first to Kwajalein, then to a small island called Kili, with no lagoon and no safe harbor of its own. They tried to go home in the 1970s and had to be evacuated a second time when tests found dangerous levels of cesium-137 building up in their bodies from the food grown in that soil. To this day, they have never permanently returned. The same contamination that scattered a whole people across the Pacific is the exact thing that sealed the fleet on the lagoon floor. One weapon did both, and to me, that's the part of this whole story that's hardest to sit with. We protect the ships. We turn them into a monument, a World Heritage Site, a thing worth guarding forever. The people who actually lived there got a promise that it would be temporary, and they're still waiting on it 80 years later. And that's the answer almost nobody guesses. The wrecks are still loaded because they were loaded on purpose, sunk before anyone could ever unload them, sealed shut by radiation nobody could scrub off, and then, once they finally could have been touched, left alone on purpose as the only honest monument to what those bombs really were. It isn't neglect keeping a carrier full of live bombs on the bottom of the Pacific. It's protection, and they're still down there tonight. The Saratoga sits upright with her planes. The Arkansas holds those 6-foot dents in her armor, and the Nagato hangs upside down over her guns, oil still sitting in her tanks, slowly rusting toward the day it finally works its way out. A whole armed fleet frozen at the exact second 2 atomic bombs went off, kept as evidence and left as a grave. So maybe the real question isn't why nobody has cleared it. Maybe it's whether anyone ever should. Some things might just be meant to stay exactly where the bomb left them. There are more places like this than you'd ever guess. Quiet corners of the ocean holding something the world quietly decided not to look at too closely. I've got another one lined up for you next, so I'll see you down there.